I lost feeling in my hands before the guard did. My mother's voice carried clean across the parking lot, bright and amused, the same tone she used when she told the dental hygienist that no, she didn't need to floss more, she just had good genes. Oh, her? No, she's not anyone, she's just my plus one for the night. She patted my arm like I was a coat she'd forgotten to check. 22 years in that uniform, and she still pushes paper around a desk somewhere in Ottawa. Don't worry about her ID, just wave us through, we're late for the reception. The young constable at the gate didn't wave us through. He took my card with both hands, the way you'd take something that might still be live. His flashlight found the gold seal first, then the rank insignia stitched into the laminate, then my face, then the seal again, like he needed 3 passes to believe what was in front of him. I watched the color leave him in real time, draining from his cheeks down into his collar. He straightened so fast his heels cracked together on the pavement, and his hand came up in a salute that had no business being that sharp at 11 o'clock on a Friday night. Deputy Commissioner. His voice cracked on the second syllable. He turned, keyed his radio, and I heard him say, with something close to panic, "Gate 2, we have a deputy commissioner on site. I repeat, Deputy Commissioner Ashworth is at the gate. Somebody get the duty officer down here right now." My mother laughed. An actual laugh, the kind she did at parties when she thought someone had made a joke at her expense, and she wanted everyone to know she found it cute rather than insulting. "Sweetheart, you've got the wrong woman, she just answers phones," she told him, reaching for my card like she could take it back and undo what he'd already seen. He didn't hand it to her. He didn't even look at her. He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time, which, in a way, after 31 years he was the only person standing in that parking lot who actually did. But before I get into why a 23-year-old constable nearly had a heart attack over a piece of laminated plastic, I should tell you about the kitchen table I grew up eating breakfast at in Glace Bay, Nova Scotia, because that's where this whole thing really started. Long before any of us knew what I'd grow up to be. My father fixed boats for a living, small fishing vessels mostly, diesel engines and hydraulics, working out of a shed that smelled permanently of two-stroke oil and rust. He believed in exactly one thing his whole life, and it wasn't God, even though my mother dragged us to the United Church every Sunday until I was 12. What my father believed in was weight. If you couldn't hold it, lift it, or feel it cut into your palm, it wasn't real, and it definitely wasn't worth his attention. The year I turned 10, he came in from the shed holding a piece of scrap rebar he'd bent and hammered into the rough shape of a fish hook, and he set it down on the kitchen table hard enough to rattle the salt shaker. "That's a thing," he said, like he was settling an argument nobody else knew they were having. "That's a thing you can hold." I was 3 feet away holding a blue ribbon from the regional science fair, the corners already soft from how tightly I'd been gripping it on the bus ride home. I'd built a working scale model of a hydroelectric turbine out of a coffee can, magnets I'd pulled from old speakers, and copper wire I'd wound myself for 6 weeks in the shed after my father went to bed, careful never to touch his tools without asking, even though he never noticed enough to say no. I held the ribbon up. My father glanced at it the way you glance at a flyer somebody stapled to a telephone pole, and he shrugged one shoulder and went to wash up for supper. Not a word about the turbine. Not a word about the wiring, which had taken me 3 tries to get right. Or the fact that the judges had made me explain how it worked twice because they didn't believe a 12-year-old had done it alone. 90 seconds later, my brother Cole came through the screen door, holding a participation medal over his head with both hands like he just won Olympic gold instead of finishing 4th in a Pee-wee hockey tournament in New Waterford. My mother came off the couch like she'd been launched. She wrapped him up, kissed the medal, kissed his hair, and put the medal on a nail by the fridge where it would stay, joined eventually by every other ribbon, plaque, and trophy he ever touched, until that whole wall looked like a shrine to a career he never actually had. I stood by the stairs holding my turbine and my ribbon, and nobody asked me a single question about either one. I learned that night, the way kids learn things without anyone teaching them on purpose, that I was the furniture in that house, and Cole was the family. That pattern didn't soften with age. If anything, it calcified. By the time I was 16, my grades didn't matter. My part-time job stocking shelves at the Sobeys didn't matter. The fact that I was teaching myself electronics out of library books didn't matter, because none of it could be photographed at a hockey rink with proud parents in the stands. My father died that spring. Aneurysm, fast, no warning, gone before the ambulance made it down our road. And at the funeral, Cole, 16 years old and suddenly the man of the house, according to every aunt who hugged him, fell apart in my mother's arms while relatives lined up to comfort him. I didn't cry. Not because I didn't feel anything, but because somebody had to deal with the funeral home, who'd quoted us $900 over what the package was supposed to cost. And somebody had to call Nova Scotia Power because the bill was 3 months overdue and they were threatening to cut the lights 2 days before the service. I stood behind a support pillar at the funeral home with a flip phone, a notepad, and a calculator, settling invoices while my mother accepted casserole. That night, while Cole slept in my mother's bed because he said he couldn't be alone, I sat at the kitchen table until 4 in the morning writing 41 thank you cards in my best handwriting to everyone who'd shown up because somebody needed to, and it was never going to be him. I joined the RCMP this September after I turned 19, partly because Depot Division in Regina was the furthest thing from Glace Bay I could find that would still take a girl with no connections and a community college to diploma in electronics, and partly because, for the first time in my life, I wanted to be somewhere that judged me on what I could actually do instead of what I could be photographed doing. I excelled at the technical side faster than anyone expected, especially the instructors who'd clocked me as quiet and underestimated quiet for soft. Within 6 years, I'd transferred into the explosives disposal unit, then cross-trained with the National Underwater Recovery Team, because it turned out the same patience that let me sit still for 6 weeks winding copper wire in a shed was exactly the patience you needed to kneel beside a device that could end you in a tenth of a second and figure out calmly which wire mattered and which one didn't. I never told my family any of this. Not because it was classified, most of it wasn't, but because every single time I'd tried to share something that mattered to me growing up, I'd watched it land on the floor between us and get stepped over. So I stopped offering. When my mother asked what I did, I said, government work, boring stuff, paperwork mostly, and she nodded and went back to talking about Cole's latest job, which never seemed to last more than 8 months but was always, according to her, about to turn into something big. What I did instead of explaining myself was send money. It started small, $200 here and there when Cole's truck got repossessed the first time, $300 when my mother's furnace died the winter I was 26. It never stopped being small in any individual instance, but it never actually stopped, period, for 15 years. E-transfer set up on autopay so nobody would have to ask twice and risk the indignity, as my mother put it once, of having to remind me. Cole's rent when a sure-thing investment fell through. My mother's roof. Cole's truck again. My mother's hip surgery copay. The dental work OHIP didn't cover when she briefly moved to Ontario to be near him. The wedding she threw him that he never actually had because the engagement fell apart 8 months later, and nobody offered to pay me back for the deposit on the hall. I did the math exactly once, sitting in a hotel room in Halifax after a 41-hour shift clearing a device off the hull of a container ship in the harbor, my hands still faintly smelling of salt water and the particular chemical sting of debt cord. Over 15 years, it came to just over $410,000. Money I'd earned doing work that could have ended with somebody reading my mother my obituary, sent home to people who thought I answered phones. I kept showing up anyway. Every holiday I could get leave for, I drove or flew to whichever province they'd landed in that year, and every time, the seating arrangement was the same. Cole at the head of the table, regardless of whose house it was, telling some embellished version of a business deal he'd almost closed. My mother, beaming, asking him questions she never asked me, refilling his glass before he asked. Me, somewhere in the kitchen, doing dishes because somebody always needed to, and it was never going to be him. Once, at a Thanksgiving in Mississauga, Cole told the table, in front of his then-fiancé's parents, that he had a guy in the military who called him for advice on logistics. I was sitting 4 feet away. Nobody at that table knew the guy he was talking about was me, because he'd never once asked what I actually did, and I'd never once corrected him, because by then correcting him felt like throwing a stone into water that had already closed over my head 1,000 times before. The night of the gate happened because the RCMP was holding its annual Commissioner's Commendation Gala at the National Division Building in Ottawa, the first year I was up for the Order of Merit, and my mother had been visiting Cole in the city that week, and I'd made the mistake, the one mistake in 15 years, of inviting her as my +1 because some small, stubborn, idiot part of me still thought maybe this time, maybe if she saw the building, saw the room, saw whatever was about to happen, something would finally click. I should have known better the second we got out of the cab. She spent the entire walk from the parking lot complaining that her shoes weren't right for the gravel, that the building looked like a courthouse, that she hoped there'd be decent wine because the last work thing of Cole's she'd attended had terrible wine. And then we hit the gate, and she told a 23-year-old constable that I was nobody, that I pushed paper, that he should hurry up and wave us through. He didn't wave us through. He called the duty officer. Within 90 seconds, my direct superior, an assistant commissioner I'd worked under for 6 years, came jogging out of the building himself, no jacket, tie loosened, and the first thing out of his mouth wasn't to me. It was to the guard. "Stand down, son. She's not a problem. She's the reason half of us are still breathing." Then he turned to me, grinning, completely oblivious to the woman standing beside me with her mouth slightly open. Ashworth, you weren't supposed to be here for another 20 minutes. We're still setting up the stage for your citation. My mother went very, very quiet. The kind of quiet that, in my experience, only ever preceded either an apology or a complete denial, and with my mother, it was rarely the first one. Citation for what? She finally said, in a voice that had lost its earlier brightness entirely. For the harbor job in October, the assistant commissioner said, like this was obvious. Like everyone in Canada should know about the harbor job in October, which, a fair number of people in Atlantic Canada did. Because the device I'd disarmed on the hull of that container ship had been 40 minutes from detonating in a way that would have taken out a third of the working harbor and possibly the elementary school 600 meters up the shoreline. It had made the news for about a day and a half under a headline that didn't include my name, because that's standard procedure, and I'd never bothered to tell my mother it was me, because by then I genuinely didn't expect her to care. She cared now. Or at least, she cared about how this looked, which with my mother had always been close enough to the same thing that I'd stopped trying to tell the two apart. Inside, under lights that made everyone look slightly more important than they were, I stood on a small stage in my dress uniform while a citation was read. The words exceptional valor, sustained risk to personal safety, and service exceeding all reasonable expectation of duty floating somewhere above the room, landing on everyone except, it seemed, the one person I'd spent 31 years trying to make hear them. My mother sat in the third row, her wine untouched, her face doing something I'd genuinely never seen it do before, which was nothing at all, just stillness. Just the look of someone doing very fast, very late arithmetic. She didn't say anything to me on the cab ride back to Cole's apartment. Not one word, which from my mother was its own kind of seismic event. It wasn't until 3 weeks later, when she called me at 11 at night, her voice already wrecked, that I understood what the silence had actually been. I found something, she said. I was cleaning out the storage unit because the rent went up and your brother said he couldn't help with it this month. And I found something of your father's I never knew about. It was a small steel toolbox, the cheap kind, from a Canadian Tire that had probably been on sale, and inside it, wrapped in a shop rag gone stiff with age, was a piece of scrap rebar, hand-bent and hammered into the rough shape of a fishhook, almost identical to the one he'd dropped on the kitchen table the day I turned 10, except this one had words burned into the metal with a soldering iron, in his blunt, uneven hand. 5 words. Caught the best one. My girl. My mother's voice broke on every other syllable reading it to me over the phone. He never says anything. He never once said anything to me about you, about any of it, the science fair, the turbine, none of it. I thought he didn't care. I let myself believe he didn't care, because it was easier than asking him why he never showed it. And I built our whole house around your brother because somebody in this family needed to be celebrated out loud. And I told myself it didn't matter that it was never you, because you never seemed to need it. She was crying outright now, the kind of crying that doesn't care if anyone's listening. Why did you let me do that to you? Why did you let me treat you like you didn't matter for 30 years? I sat with the phone against my ear in my apartment in Ottawa for a long moment before I answered her, because for the first time in my adult life, I didn't have a calm, professional, diffuse-the-device answer ready. What I had instead was the truth, which came out slower and shakier than I expected. Because I learned the same lesson Dad taught me, just pointed the wrong direction, I said. He thought only things you could hold in your hands mattered. I decided the way to survive this family was to make myself something you couldn't see, so there'd be more room for Cole to be seen. I taught all of you how to look past me. That's on me too, not just you. There was no accusation in it by the time I said it out loud, just 31 years of weight finally getting set down on a table where someone else could see it. Neither of us had been entirely wrong, and neither of us had been entirely right, and both of us had spent decades building a house on the same lie. That love means making yourself smaller so somebody else has more room to shine. The reunion happened that August, back in Glace Bay, in the house my mother still owned, the one with Cole's wall by the front hallway, the one that had been covered floor to ceiling since I was 12 with hockey ribbons, participation trophy from a tournament he didn't even place in, and a framed jersey from a beer league team he'd quit after one season. When I walked in, the wall was bare, every nail pulled, every hole filled and sanded, fresh paint covering 30 years of his accomplishments like none of them had ever happened. Cole was standing on a kitchen chair in front of it when I came through the door, a level in one hand and a hammer in the other, his hands shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the weight of either tool. He didn't look at me right away. He measured, marked the wall in pencil, and with a kind of careful precision I had genuinely never once seen him apply to anything in his entire life, he hung my Order of Merit citation, framed, alongside a photograph of me in dive gear on the deck of a Coast Guard vessel that someone, I never found out who, must have requested from the detachment. Next to those, on a small brass hook he'd installed himself, He hung my father's steel fishhook, the words, "Caught the best one, my girl," catching the light from the front window. He stepped down off the chair, set the hammer on the counter without a word, and for the rest of that evening, for the first time since he was 8 years old, holding a trophy over his head, Cole didn't tell a single story about himself. He poured my coffee before I asked. He sat with his head down through most of dinner, in a silence that had nothing performative in it at all. Before we ate, my mother stood up at the head of the table, gripping the back of her chair to keep steady, and her voice carried clear across the room in a way I'd never once heard her use for me. "This is my daughter," she said. "She defuses bombs and pulls bodies out of the ocean for a living, and she's been doing it for over a decade while sending money home to people who never bothered to ask what her job actually was. For 30 years, I made her invisible in her own family, and I told myself it was because she didn't need the attention, when really it was because it was easier than admitting I'd failed her. I was wrong. Tonight I want her to know that, and I want every single person at this table to actually see her the way I should have from the day she was born." It wasn't a long speech. It didn't need to be. 30 years had built the silence, and it only took 30 seconds to finally name it. A few nights later, back in my own apartment, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, running my thumb along the edge of my collar, where the rank insignia caught the light. The most expensive lesson of my career had nothing to do with explosives or tide charts or the cold black water of a harbor at midnight. It was this: people will follow your orders because regulations say they have to. They'll salute you because the uniform demands it. But being truly seen only happens when the people who are supposed to love you make the deliberate, uncomfortable choice to put down what they want to believe about themselves and actually look at who you are. Sacrifice without a boundary doesn't build gratitude. It builds entitlement, and entitlement left alone for long enough turns into cruelty, quiet and polite and completely unaware of itself. I sent that money for 15 years and I'd do most of it again, because that's not where I went wrong. Where I went wrong was letting myself disappear so thoroughly that nobody in my family even knew there was something there worth seeing. Pride doesn't come from how much you can carry in silence. It comes from the moment you stop protecting everyone else's comfortable version of you and start insisting, quietly but completely, on the truth.